Okay, so we're on the next section of the problem of political authority. Not a problem, but I suppose it's a big problem as well. Individual security in a stateless society. So we have a non-state system of justice. And again, there's larger passages I'm going to read, but the rest is just going to be summaries for you to get a feel of the content and the argumentation. So this first subsection is a non-state system of justice. First, protection agencies. That's the argument or the form that we are most useful to. And he starts with saying, in any realistic human society, even an anarchist one, at least some individuals will commit aggression against others. And I think we can all agree upon that. And he says, why does the anarchist not stipulate the details of non-state security arrangements? And that's always a question. Well, how will it work? You know, we can speculate, but we can't dictate. Like, you're dictating how a spontaneous system is going to arise. That kind of defeats the whole purpose of a spontaneous system. But it says, because the functioning of the system is determined by the individuals occupying it, therefore the answers to the questions of how the system would work must take the form of speculative predictions rather than stipulations. The same is true of any untried institution, though this fact is little recognized. The details of security arrangements would be determined by market forces and individual choices. Next would be arbitration firms, another thing I think most of us are familiar with. In an anarchic society, just as government-based societies, people would sometimes have disputes. One important kind of dispute occurs, then he talks about crimes and things like that. And it says, in the absence of a state, a lot of these needs would be supplied by private arbitration firms. And these are the basic institutions of a well-ordered anarchist society. In such a society, the most fundamental functions commonly ascribed to the state are not eliminated by private, but privatized. So that, though, brings in a section I am going to read in full, because I hear this all the time. But if all this is true, is that really anarchy? It says the system just sketched is commonly referred to as anarcho-capitalism, free market anarchism, or libertarian anarchism. One might ask, however, whether the system truly qualifies as a form of anarchy, rather than, say, a system of competing governments. Okay, I will say my own comment. I forgot what he said at this point. It's been a while since I read it. Anarchists are not against governments. We are against the state. So yeah, in some sense, I think, yes, it's just a system of competing governments. Because the minute you add competition, you remove territorial coercive monopoly, our objections are removed. Semantic questions about the use of government and anarchy are of no great importance. I actually think they are. But however, the system differs in two critical respects from all presently existing governmental systems, and it is these differences that lead me to call the system a form of anarchy. The first difference is one of voluntariness versus coerciveness. Governments force everyone to accept their services. As we have seen, the social contract is a myth. Protection agencies, by contrast, are chosen by customers. I lost my spot. Who make actual literal contracts with them. The second difference is one of competition versus monopoly. So he's basically not going the route of calling one a state and one a government. But I think those distinctions are helpful. Governments hold geographical monopolies on protection and dispute resolution services, and changing one's government tends to be very difficult and costly, so governments feel little competitive pressure. And the anarchist system, protection agencies and arbitration companies are in constant competition with each other. If one were dissatisfied with one's protection agency, one could switch to another agency at little cost without moving to another country. These two differences are the fundamental source of all the advantages claimed for anarcho-capitalism over traditional government. The voluntariness of the anarcho-capitalist scheme makes it more just than a coercive system, and both traits make the anarcho-capitalist system less abusive and more responsive to people's needs than coercive monopolistic systems. Now, he puts, where does this footnote come in? Number 3. Yeah, where he's talking about the territorial monopoly of governments. He puts in a footnote where someone uses the word state instead, and I would agree with the footnote. Compare Weber's well-known definition of government. The state, I think he just did a bait and switch. Seems like this is a definition of the state, not a definition of government. The state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. And this is a definition all the way back to 1946. So this isn't a modern definition, though it might be a more modern distinction between government and the state. I haven't really traced that back. I've always heard of it, but that could be a relatively recent libertarian idea. I don't know. Now, the biggest objection that gets brought up to competing protection agencies is that they'll just go to war with each other. So there's a section, conflict between protectors. It says, competing security agencies might seem to have a significant motive for direct physical confrontation with each other. Since they are in direct economic competition, one agency might wish to attack another in the hopes of putting the other agency out of business. Or in the event of a dispute between customers of different agencies, security agencies might go to war to defend their respective clients' interests rather than allowing the dispute to be resolved by arbitration. For these reasons, some argue that an anarchist society would be riven with interagency wars. And I've heard this objection all the time. I've never particularly found it valid. It seems like people who have played too many video games. But he goes on to say you're dealing with human self-interest, and it's a primary motivator in an anarchic society, and he brings up the cost of violence. He goes, violent conflict tends to be very dangerous for both parties, and he notes, we went through this before. Rational individuals, therefore, seek to avoid provoking such conflicts and prefer peaceful methods of dispute resolution, such as third-party arbitration whenever available. But in spite of the prudential and moral arguments against engaging in avoidable violent confrontations, such confrontations periodically break out among ordinary individuals. Why does this occur? In essence, the reason is that in the general population, there are a wide variety of attitudes and motivations, and among all these variety, there are some individuals with unusually high degrees of physical confidence, unusually low concern for their own safety, and unusually low capacity for impulse control, a collection of traits often referred to as recklessness. Yes, there are psychopaths and sociopaths as well. However, he says, in the course, and this might be disputable, but not to the point of violence, but maybe disputable to the point of trying to gain things for personal advantage. It says business managers, however, are considerably more uniform than the general population. They tend to share two traits in particular: a strong desire to generate profits for their businesses and a reasonable awareness of the effective means for doing so. But I do think there is a higher concentration, at least in CEOs of corporations, which I would distinguish from just businesses. As you know, I don't think corporations are even remotely libertarian, where heads of corporations, I think there's a very high percentage of psychopaths among them, but I don't think it makes them murderous psychopaths. It just makes them ruthless. And we will finish up in this last section, which we have quite a bit to read from because it's on the violent confrontation of competing security agencies. Also, employees of a security agency have their own individual wills, distinct from the goals of the agency. And I think this is a much better argument. If management decided to attack another agency solely to put a competitor out of business, widespread desertion is the most probable result. Most people in contemporary societies are strongly opposed to murdering other members of their society. This is not to deny that some human beings are murderers. It is only to say that the overwhelming majority of human beings are strongly opposed to murder. A small percentage of people are willing to murder. However, these individuals are not generally desirable employees, and thus it is unlikely that a protection agency would wish to staff itself with such people. And then he pushes back on his own argument. What about the findings of the Milgram experiment, in which people proved willing to electrolyte a helpless victim when ordered so by science? The fear of defying authority can overcome people's resistance to murder. Though business managers have much less of an aura of authority than government officials, might a security agency manager nevertheless be able to exploit this flaw in human nature to induce employees to kill members of rival agencies? He goes on, perhaps one could, though it is worth noting a few other features of Milgram's experiments. First, the gradual escalation of the experimenter's demands. Starting from a seemingly legitimate scientific experiment was a crucial feature of the design. If Stanley Milgram had simply handed a pistol to his subjects as they walked in the door and told them to shoot another subject, he would not have succeeded. And perhaps a clever security agency manager versed in psychology could similarly manipulate circumstances. Second, Milgram's subjects were not in any personal danger from the person they were supposedly electrocuting. If the learner in the experiment had the ability to shock the teacher back, it is doubtful how far the teacher would have continued with the experiment. A warlike company manager would need to convince employees not only to murder, but to risk being killed in return. That is a much more tempering situation, I think. Third, most of Milgram's subjects obeyed. They did so with great reluctance, exhibiting signs of extreme stress. Even if a warlike agency managed to get employees to commit murder, the employees would be extremely unhappy, and the agency would probably soon lose most of its employees. During the 1960s, American war protesters displayed posters and bumper stickers with the slogan, "What if they gave a war and nobody came?" In the unlikely event that a protection agency declared war against another agency, residents of the anarchist society might finally have the chance to observe the answer to this question. All right, you'll probably see me in a costume change before we continue. I tend to do these in 10-minute sprints so that I stay motivated to add my commentary. Okay, back to continue. Ah, great. Just pulled off one of my fingernails, as happens. We'll have to fix that. But anyway, getting back to this chapter. So conflict between governments, he says, it is he. There seems to be several reasons for expecting the problem of intergovernmental warfare to be more serious than that of interagency warfare. Business leaders tend to be driven chiefly by the profit motive. Government leaders are more likely to be driven by ideology or the desire for power. Because of the enormous costs of armed conflict, the latter motivations are much more likely motives for armed conflict than the desire for financial gain. So he's saying why you should be more concerned about intergovernmental warfare rather than interagency, if I wasn't making it clear. Two, due to their monopolistic positions, governments can afford to make extremely large and costly errors without fear of being supplanted. For example, the estimated combined cost of the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is $2.4 trillion, and yet the U.S. government need fear no loss of market share as a result of this dubious investment. If each American could choose between a government that carried on these wars and one that did not, and if each individual were guaranteed to actually get what he chooses, then even the most ardent hawks might find themselves thinking twice about the price tag. Fortunately for the government, individuals have no such choice. Governments have much better propagandistic tools at their disposal than private businesses. Since most people believe in political authority, the state can claim that citizens are morally obligated to go to war whether they support the war or not. The state may portray combat under its command as fighting for one's country, which is generally seen as noble and honorable. A private business seeking to increase profits by killing competitors would have a harder sell. Human beings are far more willing to kill those who are perceived as very different from themselves, especially foreigners, than to kill ordinary members of their own society. Consequently, it is easier to convince people to go to war against another country than it would be to convince people to attack employees of another company. And there's quite a bit here, but I think this shows us why government is much more dangerous than the alleged dangers of these private security agencies. Modern military training employs techniques of intensive psychological conditioning and desensitization to overcome soldiers' humane instincts. The U.S. military adopted techniques of this kind in response to Marshall's findings concerning the low rate of firing by World War II soldiers. As a result, the rate of fire reportedly increased from 25% in World War II to 55% in the Korean War and close to 90% in the Vietnam War. Employees of a security company, however, are less likely to submit to military-style conditioning since they would not see the need of combat with other security agencies to begin with. Due to its pervasive control over the society from which its soldiers are drawn, the state can and does apply powerful sanctions to soldiers who refuse to fight or citizens who refuse to be drafted. Unlike a governmental system, those who refuse to fight at their government's command must flee the country to avoid imprisonment or execution. Under an anarchist system, those who refuse to fight at their employer's command must merely find another job. Because of their monopolistic position and their ability to collect non-voluntary payments from the populace, governments tend to have far greater resources than non-governmental organizations, enabling them to accumulate vast arsenals, even during peacetime. For example, as of this writing, the U.S. government maintains 10 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers, which cost $4.5 billion apiece, plus $240 million per year for maintenance, while generating zero revenue. As a result, when war breaks out between governments, it's far more destructive than any kind of conflict involving other agents. The death toll from war in the 20th century is estimated in the neighborhood of 140 million, and the population may yet prove the cause, and the problem may yet prove the cause for the extinction of the human species. Taking all these observations into account, then, it appears that warfare is a greater concern with governments than with protection agencies. Next section is protection for criminals. It says, there are at least 3 important asymmetrics that favor the protection of non-criminal persons over criminals. First, far more people wish to be protected against crime than wish to be protected in committing crimes. Almost no one desires to be a crime victim, while only a few desire to be criminals. Second, the harms suffered by victims of crime are typically far greater than the benefits enjoyed by those who commit crimes. Ordinary people would therefore be willing to pay more to avoid being victimized than criminals would be willing to pay for the chance to victimize others. The third asymmetry is that criminals choose to commit crimes, whereas crime victims do not choose to be victims. So then he goes to compare it to criminal protection by the government. But what about the analogous problem for governments? Are there forces that prevent a government from acting to protect criminals? It says, as of today, democratic governments function as tools for special interest groups to steal from the rest of society. Ooh. I am going to have to tweet that immediately, if not sooner. And then last, before we take a break, and you'll see another costume change, because I like doing these in sprints. Justice for sale. Some object to free market provision of protective services on the grounds that justice should not be bought and sold. On the surface, this objection skirts uncomfortably close to a bare denial of the anarcho-capitalist position. To avoid begging the question, the objector must articulate a specific reason why protection and dispute resolution services should not be bought and sold. 2 initially plausible reasons might be offered, and he gets into those, and those seems like those two plausible reasons that might be offered are pre-existing entitlement and basing law on justice. So we will start on that in the next section. Bye. And we're back. So, pre-existing entitlement is where we left off. One argument is that people should not have to pay for justice because everyone is entitled to have justice to begin with. Just as I should not have to pay for my own car, again, once I already own it, I should not have to pay for anything else to which I'm already entitled. He says, in one sense, this is correct, but it's a flaw in human nature, not a flaw in the system, because criminals exist. So, given that some people do not, in fact, respect other people's rights, the best solution is for some members of society to provide protection to others. Those who provide such services are justly entitled to ask for compensation for their time, their material expenses, and the physical risks they undertake, at least as much as anyone else who provides services of value to others. It would be unjust to demand that they bear all these burdens, while their beneficiaries, those whom they perfect, may simply proceed with their own self-serving occupations, bearing none of the costs of their own defense. And that's going on today, by the way. Based, not for everybody, but it is in fact going on. Basing law on justice. Another reason for thinking that protection from crime should not be subject to market forces is that this is incompatible with the laws being determined, as they ought to be, by what's morally right and just. It says, in inverting to self-interest to explain how security agencies and an anarchist society would behave, I'm not advocating selfishness. I am recognizing it as an aspect of human nature which exists regardless of which social system we occupy. And he then goes on and flips it and says, but what about buying justice from the government? The preceding objections, in any case, cannot favor government over anarchy, because government is subject to the very same objections. In a government-dominated system, people must pay for justice, just as surely as in an anarchist system. It's not as though courts and police forces can somehow operate without cost, if only they are monopolistic and coercive. If one must choose between a system in which people serve self-interest in the name of justice and one in which people serve justice in the name of self-interest, surely we must prefer the latter. To prefer a system that hands people the tools to exploit others for selfish ends while assuring them that they are supposed to serve justice, over a system that makes justice profitable and allows people to choose their course, would be to repose a utopian faith in the power of supposition. The second reply is that there is no reason why the members of an anarchy may not embrace equally idealistic norms of those of a democratic society. Just as citizens of a democratic state believe that public officials should promote justice, the members of an anarchy may hold that protection agencies and arbitration firms should promote justice. However much efficacy that kind of social norm has in policing human behavior, the anarchists may harness it just as well as the statists. Okay, and now he's moving on. It says another concern is that security agencies driven by the profit motive will cater solely to the rich, leaving the poor defenseless against criminals. But then he goes on to say, and it's probably going to be a couple more sections. Do businesses, means today, serve the poor? Unfortunately, there are no actual societies with a free market in security. We can, however, examine societies with relatively free markets in a variety of other goods and services. And such societies, for how many of those other goods and services is it true that suppliers cater solely to the rich, providing no such products suitable for middle and lower income customers? Is clothing manufactured solely for the wealthy, leaving the poor to wander the streets naked? Do supermarkets stock only caviar and Dom Perignon? Which chain is larger, Walmart or Bloomingdale's? Admittedly, there are some products such as yachts and Learjets that have yet to appear in affordable models for the average consumer, yet the overwhelming majority of industries are dominated by production for lower and middle income consumers. The main explanation is volume. For most products, there are many more consumers seeking a cheap product than consumers seeking an expensive product. The injustice inherent in crime, however, points to a flaw in human nature rather than in the anarchist system. People will suffer from crime under any feasible social system. The question is whether anarchy faces a greater problem or a greater injustice than governmental systems. He goes in, how does government treat the poor? Even if inequality in the distribution of crime is an independent injustice, this does not obviously favor government over anarchy, since large inequalities in the distribution of crime occur in all state-based societies as well, where the wealthy are much better protected than the poor. Next, thought he has is the quality of protection. How well would private protection agencies protect their clients in comparison with police under the status quo? This comparison is difficult to make since we can't observe an anarchist society. The best we can do is examine the effectiveness of government police and then make theoretical predictions about the anarchist alternative on the basis of incentive structures. So he goes on to note government's not very good at protecting the poor against crime. And he says, okay, private protection agencies might be able to deal with the common criminal, but how would they deal with organized crime? Do we not need a central authority to combat this problem? Actually, I think I can it'll be 2 sections. Because a plausible alternative approach would be to attempt to deny organized crime its most important sources of revenue. Criminal organizations are chiefly focused on collecting money, which they mostly do through the provision of illegal goods and services. Traditionally, organized crime has generated for itself revenue through gambling operations, prostitution, and during Prohibition, the illegal sale of alcohol. By far, the main source of revenue for organized crime today appears to be the illicit drug trade, which is estimated to generate between $500 billion and $900 billion in sales worldwide per year. Why have criminal organizations focused on these industries? Why sell gambling services, sexual services, and drugs rather than, say, shoes and chocolates? There's no controversy about the answer to this. It is because gambling in some forms, prostitution, and narcotic drugs are illegal. So basically saying if you legalize these things, you inherently defang organized crime. Right, we will continue. Okay, we should be on the last section here. It says protection or extortion. Rather than providing protection in exchange for agreed upon fees, it might seem that it would be more profitable for a protection agency to simply rob people without bothering about protecting them. Why wouldn't protection agencies evolve into mere extortion agencies? And he talks about this at length. I think just by taking a look at the headings, you get an idea of where he's going, like the discipline of competition. But then he goes on to say, isn't that what government does? He says, now consider the analogous problem for governmental systems. Why shouldn't the government extort money from people without protecting them? All governments, in fact, extort money, though the practice is usually termed taxation rather than extortion. Few statists even contemplate ending this practice. How then might government be thought superior to anarchy in this area? Perhaps one think that government takes less of our money than private protectors would charge, or that government provides better service than private protectors would provide. But it is difficult to see why this would be so. Imagine that a private protection agency somehow acquired a monopoly in a large geographical area and began to extract payments from the population by force. Few would contend that once the state of affairs transpired, prices would drop and service would improve. Surely the opposite would occur, but that's precisely the position of societies within government-based protection. Perhaps it's the democratic process that is supposed to induce government to control costs and maintain high-quality service. If the government does a poor job, people will vote for different politicians. The question then becomes whether this mechanism is more or less effective than the mechanism of free market competition. One shortcoming of the democratic mechanism is that the choices tend to be very limited. In some democratic societies, elections regularly offer only two choices, for example, the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. Even systems of proportional representation rarely give voters the range of options present in typical free markets. Okay, let's do the last segment of this. Wayne had come in on me before. But the more important shortcoming is that in the democratic system, when one chooses one politician over another, one does not thereby get what one chooses, one gets what the majority chooses. Therefore, there's little incentive to expend effort on rational or informed voting, and he had went over that before. Then, on the section entitled Monopolization, the size advantage in combat. Robert Nozick contends that the protection industry would succumb to natural monopoly because the value of a company's service is determined by the relative power of that company in comparison with other companies. Nozick imagines agencies doing battle to resolve disputes between customers. If one agency is more powerful than another, the more powerful agency will triumph. Recognizing that it is better to be protected by the stronger agency, the customers of weaker agencies will migrate to stronger agencies, making the latter even stronger. Since this sort of process tends to amplify initial differences in power, the natural end result is that one agency holds all the power. That is, a monopoly of the industry. Nozick goes on to explain how this dominant protection agency might develop into a full-fledged government. One day, perhaps we should go over his book. This is very clever. It didn't convince me. In fact, Nozick is the one who made me an anarchist, which is the exact opposite, I think, of the, well, not I think, of the intent of his book. But it's still a fantastic book. And just his commitment to natural rights, which is a different presupposition than Michael Huemer, but I adore Nozick. Then it says, next section, determining efficient size of firms. It says, on the other hand, large firms also tend to suffer from diseconomics of scale. Factors that tend to make a larger firm less efficient include bureaucratic insularity, alienation on the part of employees, increased costs of communication within the organization, and increased risk of duplication of effort within the organization. So he is giving some reasons why, more reasons why what Nozick said would not happen. Government monopoly. He doesn't deal with one really big argument of Nozick, which is going to be beyond the scope of this discussion, but I actually think it's the more important argument of Nozick, and that is of standardization. But continuing, government monopoly. As in the case of the previous objections, the threat of monopoly poses a more serious objection to government than to anarchy. And then he deals extensively with cartels. I don't think I need to go through this, but and HOAs versus government. But I would like to read just the conclusion, because I think it's important, and then we'll be done. All social systems are imperfect. In every society, people sometimes suffer from crime and injustice. In an anarchist society, this would remain true. The test of anarchism as a political ideal is whether it can reduce the quantity of injustice suffered relative to the best alternative system. Now, of course, I don't believe in his cost analysis here. I think his cost analysis is correct, don't get me wrong. But to me, that's not the litmus test. The litmus test is violating rights, but he doesn't come at this from a natural rights perspective. So I appreciate that he's making an argument for anarchy, not strictly from a consequentialist perspective, because he argues that natural rights, I'm just recapping some of, this in the beginning of this book, that natural rights are what we all intuit for the most part, but he believes they can be overcome with a sufficient enough need. I do not. Goes, which I take to be representative democracy. I have argued that a particular sort of anarchist system, one that employs a free market for the provision of security, holds the promise of a safer, more efficient, and more just society. The radical nature of this proposal usually calls forth strong resistance. It is said that justice, I'm just keep checking the time because I got to go down to do my show. It is said that justice should not be for sale, that the agencies will be at constant war with one another, that they will serve criminals instead of their victims, that they will only serve the rich, that they won't be able to protect us as well as the government, that they will turn into extortion agencies, that a monopoly or cartel will evolve to exploit the customers. These objections fairly flood forth when students, professors, and educated lay people are first introduced to the idea of non-state protective services. But if we examine the proposal more carefully and at greater length, we see that none of these objections are well-founded. Anarchists have well-reasoned accounts, grounded in economic theory and realistic premises about human psychology, of how an anarchist society would avoid each of the disasters that critics fear. Most of the objections raised against anarchy, in fact, apply more clearly and forcefully to government. This fact is often overlooked because when confronted with radical ideas, we tend to look only for objections to the new ideas rather than for objections to the status quo. For example, the most common objection to anarchism, the objection that protection agencies would go to war with one another, overlooks both the extreme costliness of combat and the strong opposition that most people feel to murdering other people. The very real threat of war between governments appears a much more serious concern than conflict between private security agencies. Similarly, the common objection that the security industry will be monopolized lacks foundation. Once we abandon the notion of security agencies doing battle with one another, economic features of the industry, particularly the minimal fixed costs for security companies, should lead us to predict a great number of small firms rather than a single enormous firm. On the other hand, a governmental system is monopolistic by definition and should therefore be expected to suffer from the usual problems of monopolies. The central advantage of the free market anarchist system over a governmental system are twofold. First, the anarchist system rests on voluntary cooperation and is therefore more just than a system that relies on coercion. Second, the anarchist system incorporates meaningful competition amongst providers of security, leading to higher quality and lower costs. As a result of these features of the system, individuals living in a free market anarchy could expect to enjoy greater freedom and greater security at a lower cost than those subject to the traditional system of coercive monopolization of the security industry. And that's the end of that chapter, and I think that's so well put. We've only, I think, got 3 chapters left, and they seem shorter than some of these others, but let's take a look. The next one will be chapter 11, and perhaps here is where he's going to deal with Nozick's objection, because it is in the area of criminal justice and dispute resolution, so we'll see. Let's see if he deals with Nozick's objection of standardization. So this is, let's look at how many pages. It's just over 20 pages, so it's shorter than some of the ones we have done before. All right, I'll see you for the next one. We're almost done with this book, and I'm not really sure the next book I'm going to do. I have a feeling it might be Michael Malice's Anarchist Handbook, but we'll see. I have to see what the mood strikes me.